First up, how to log in. The Chrome web browser to launch ACEITLab.com. Log in with the demo faculty account that I created earlier. And this is the faculty page. Across the top here I have the Manage selected button, and you see it's green, so that means we're currently in that section. And underneath we've got some buttons which also show which section I'm in. We have a Lab tab or button which takes us to the lab environment, a Profile button where we can edit details about our currently logged in account, and the Log Out button to get us all the way out. Okay, so the first thing you're going to want to do is create the class. Under Manage Classes, you've got a list of classes that belong to you. You own these classes. You're going to create a new class and type in a section ID 543210. I've used that before. Look. Choose a course reference. I'm going to choose this last one on the list, Implementing Desktop App Environments 2396C. Put in a schedule, Monday, Wednesday, 0800 hours, and a comment. I'll leave that one blank for now. Click Create, and the class shows up in your class list with an extra piece of information here, the roll count, which is the number of students currently enrolled in that class. We don't have any currently enrolled in that class, so we're going to edit the class now and add students to it. Underneath the class section here, we've got a list of labs and a list of students currently associated with this class. We'll come back to labs because we haven't created a lab yet, but we're going to deal with the students section now. I'm going to add a couple of students. First off, I'm going to add a demo student to Browser.edu. This is a single email, one at a time. Click the Add button. This is what you get. The student account is added and is green to show that he's an active user account. We get some success messages at the bottom to show that it was a good email account, a good email address, I should say. The account was created, which means it didn't exist before, and it was added to this group. I can, at the bottom here, you see new student initial passwords, this section right here. This shows you the initial password for that single user that we just created. When you reset passwords over here, the message doesn't come up in a dialog right here. It comes up in the message bar at the bottom. This is only for the first account. And the reason it comes up in a separate section is for copy and paste abilities, which I shall demonstrate when I do multiple email addresses. So let me call this demo student 2. Browser.edu. There we go, and I'll create demo student 3 as well. There we go. So I'll create a couple more demo accounts, demo student 2, demo student 3, and I click at the import button now. Now I can copy and paste from other educational tools like Blackboard or WebCT or whatever you use, and paste them into here and add the accounts that way. So now I've got demo student 2, demo student 3, and a whole list of passwords, and I can copy and paste this out to some more permanent record, so that when I go to emailing the students their passwords, or when I go to a class, the first class, if it's a mixed blended class, online and classroom activity, I can hand out the passwords, distribute them how you will. I also get the same message as the bottom. Both emails were good, 2 users were created, which means the users didn't exist before, and 2 users were added to this group, so that's good. Now that's not always going to be the case where you get the maximum number, because sometimes the students exist and have joined another class. When a student is removed from their last class, the student's account is also deleted. This is another failsafe to stop students logging in if they don't have an enrollment in an online class. I can edit a student. Let's choose demo student and click edit, and I can give them a first and last name. I do this one at a time, but they don't need it. They're going to log in with their email address anyway, and if they want their profile button to have a more aesthetic display, then they can add a first and last name with their profile option. We can also click on reset password for a student as well. If I click on reset password here, and note that rather than showing up as an initial password, because the student now exists already, we see the new password show up in the message bar at the bottom, which we can then copy and paste when we log in as that student. So now I have a class with 3 students. One of the students, I know what their password is, so I just copied it into my clipboard, and a lab section, but I don't have any labs associated with this class because I don't have any labs yet. So I've got to create a lab and publish this lab to that class. The students who sign up into the system now, these 3 students, they don't need a published lab to be able to use the system. They can create their own blank labs. But having a published lab means that the faculty can pre-prepare the design of the virtual machines, which networks they're connected to, what kind of disks they have pre-populated, so the students don't have to go through that hassle. So let me, as a faculty member, now go to my lab section, and I'll notice I've got a couple of elements along this second row here. My students' labs, which is empty because my students don't have any labs yet. They haven't even logged in yet. And my labs, and I don't have any labs yet because this is a new account for me too. So I'm going to now create a new lab. So I'm going to create a new lab by clicking on the Create button. It's called Lab 01. I will rename it Demo Lab, and I don't have to rename it. They are sequentially numbered when I create new labs, but this will help my students identify which lab I'm talking about. I'm telling everybody Lab 01. A student could be enrolled in 3 different classes. Which Lab 01? So we'll give it a proper name. The ACE CD/DVD section is my system-wide ISOs that are available. My ACE volumes section right here, this is where I have some pre-populated base volumes that I'm going to create lab volumes from, so I can then associate those with virtual machines. And then I have these 3 dialogues that truly belong to the lab itself rather than system-wide. These are lab volumes, lab networks, and lab virtual machines. First thing I'll do is I'll create a couple of virtual machines. I'll create a new virtual machine with 1 vCPU and 1 GB of RAM. I shall rename it my Fedora box. There we are. It's renamed here as Fedora box, and you'll see it shows up here as Fedora box 2. I created it with a hardware profile of Linux. That's lucky. That'll allow Fedora to run on that box without any hardware changes. I'll also create another one. I'll give this one 2 vCPUs just because I've got them in my quota, and 2 gigs of RAM. And I should create that one with the Windows 8 Server 2012 hardware profile. Let me create that machine, which I shall then rename as my Winbox. See, I've done that before too. Renames here, renames here. So now I have 2 virtual machines at the bottom here. And down here I can start to tailor the components within the virtual machine. So the first thing I might like to do on the Fedora box, I'm going to add a CD. This is my CD device. You can see I've added it now. CD number 1, virtual machine Winbox doesn't have it yet. CD number 1, I've now got some buttons active where I can eject the media from it or remove the device entirely. I haven't got any media in there at the moment, so let me pick something from the system-wide ISOs. I'm going to choose Fedora 20. And I'm going to insert it into Fedora box CD1. You'll notice that Winbox doesn't show up because Winbox doesn't have a CD-ROM device. So I'm going to insert it into Fedora box CD1, insert button there, and now I have on my VM CD1 with Fedora 20 in it. I don't have anywhere to install that Fedora 22, so I'm going to have to create a disk. Unlike CDs and DVDs and NICs, you can't add a disk to a virtual machine using KVM anyway, without an associated volume. So one has to create the volume first. That's what I'm going to do up here. I'm going to create a 10 gig volume, blank volume, nothing on it, because I want to install Fedora to it. So that's my volume. It's called Vol01. It's 10 gigs, and I'm going to assign it to Fedora box. Assign. Now if I look, I didn't select that. You see, you get error message at the bottom if it doesn't work. It says fail. Attaching disk to VM. No VM ID and or volume specified. So I had a problem with selecting one or the other. I probably didn't select the radio button. So I'm going to select Vol01 and choose to assign it to the Fedora box, and then click the assign button. And that'll work just fine. Now I see down in Fedora box, under my disks section, I have disk number 1 with Vol01 assigned to it. So I have a blank 10 gig volume assigned to my virtual machine with Fedora 20 ISO in its CD-ROM drive. It doesn't have any NICs yet, so I shall create one. There we are, NIC number 1. It's been given a MAC address, but it's not assigned to any network. Up in lab networks, I can take my public network and I can assign it to a NIC. This is a list of all NICs in the lab. It's only Fedora box that has a NIC, and it only has 1 NIC. I haven't created any others. So I'm going to assign it to Fedora box 1. Selected the radio button, selected the target, click assign, and it's all good. Now that one NIC with its MAC address is now connected to the public network. I'm going to add a second one. This one I want to add to a private network. So over here I'm going to create a new network under Lab Networks, create, choose net01, which was created, and rename it private, rename. Now it's going to become the private network. And I'm going to assign the private network to FedoraBox NIC2 that I just created, and assign that. Now at the bottom of FedoraBox I have two NICs, one associated with the public network and one associated with the private network. Then I'm going to go to the Winbox, and I want to add a NIC to that as well. This is currently not assigned to anything. Choose the private network in the Lab Network section and choose Winbox NIC1 and assign. And the Winbox is now assigned a NIC in the private network. I'm not going to bother adding a CD DVD ISO to Winbox, but I will add the device. You never quite know when you need a CD device for ISOs. You might want to be installing software from the original media as part of your lab project. So I'll add the device anyway. I can add up to 4 CD-ROM devices, up to 4 disks, and up to 4 NICs in each virtual machine. I do want a disk, but I don't want to install Windows on this virtual machine. I'm going to go from a pre-prepared volume. So I'm going to go with my Windows 2012 R2 GUI 16 gig volume. Now there's 3 columns of data here in these in this volume table. I want to explain this since I'm right here. When you're creating a lab volume populated here that I can then assign to a VM from a base volume in this 8th volume section, it's the number at the end, the amount of free space in the volume. That's the cost of the volume for the student. When I create a blank volume, 10 gigs for example, for volume 1, that took 10 gigs of my 60 gigs quota for storage. But when I choose this Windows 2012 R2 GUI image, which is a 16 gig image, it's only going to cost me 8 gigs of my quota. And that's because the 16 gig disk has already been created with 8 gigs of that disk taking up space on the shared storage. And that's true for every student. Every student points to the same space on that same hypervisor. So 8 gigs has already been allocated. So the student is able to add only another 8 gigs. So they're only reserving 8 gigs worth of extra space, which is why it only costs the student 8 gigs to add this 16 gig volume to their lab volumes. So I'm going to choose that Windows 2012 R2 GUI volume. I'm going to create a lab volume from it. Now over here you can see I've got Vol 02 based on Windows 2012 R2 GUI 16 gigs, and it's only cost me 8 gigs. So I'm only up to 18 out of 60. So going with pre-prepared images is actually saving space. And then I'm going to assign this volume to my Winbox. Assign. And that will create a disk number 1. Vol 02 is the assigned volume for that disk. So I have a couple of virtual machines, a Linux box with 1 vCPU, 1 gig, and a CD-ROM drive with Fedora 20 installation media, a blank 10 gig volume, and 2 NICs, one on the public network, one on the private network, and my Windows box with 2 virtual CPUs, 2 gigs of RAM, with a Windows 8 hardware profile will make it slightly more efficient, a CD-ROM device with no media in it, Vol 02, which is based on a Windows 2012 R2 GUI sysprepped 16 gig image, and a NIC in the private network. And I'm now ready to publish this lab to my class, so that my class will start with what I see here. So in order to publish this lab to the class, I need to go to the class. I go to the Manage section, choose the class, click on the Edit button, and you'll notice that my Labs section is currently empty within the class, and on the right hand side here within my Labs section, I see my demo lab that I just created. Now click the Publish button, and you'll notice that demo lab is now listed in the lab section for the class. It's grey because it's an inactive lab, it's not running on a hypervisor anywhere, but that's desirable, that's okay. So now these students, when they sign in, will have access to my pre-prepared demo lab, and they can copy it to their lab section. Now once the lab is published, if I were to go back to my lab section and have a look at my demo lab, you'll notice I've got this big stamp across the middle. It's just a visual cue for me to show that I've shared this lab with the class. Therefore any changes I make to it will be made to the published element, which means if a student subsequently copies this lab to their lab section, they'll get my changes. But any students that have already copied the lab won't have those changes, because it's a copy of the lab. Every student copies the lab design. They don't get direct access to it. Otherwise, this lab will be changing every time a student makes a change to it. I have a button at the top here as well. This unpublished button is now available to me because it's now a published lab. I can unpublish it. I could do this using the revoke button in the class edit screen, but that's only for one class. The unpublished button will unpublish this or revoke this lab from all classes that it's currently associated with. And if I would unpublish, for example, it brings me back to no stamp, so I can redesign this lab or add elements to it to publish again. And if I were to go back to the manage section, edit the class, you'll notice that my demo lab has been removed from this class. So I'll publish it again to give those three students access back to the demo lab. But that's a side effect of publishing the lab. Alright, so now let's have a look at how this affects students, what the student experience will be like after publishing this lab and seeing what it's like to actually create a lab. So I need to log in as a student. I can't remember the student's password, so for demo purposes only, I'm going to edit my class, choose a student. I'll choose demo student at Brown.edu. I shall reset that password so that I can log in. I'm going to copy that password. It turns up in the message bar down there, and I'm going to log in as that user. I'm not going to use another Chrome windows. Session information is shared across all Chrome windows on a single machine. So if I log in as one user on another window, it's going to destroy the session on this window. So I'm going to use a competing browser. Don't all gasp at once. It's Internet Explorer. Demo student at Broward.edu, and a password which I shall paste in. There we go. Log in. That. And so here I am logged in as a student. You can see my demo student at Broward.edu shows up on my profile button, which I can click. And I can add a more aesthetic name. My first name is demo, last name student, very original. Save that. See, so that my button shows up with a more aesthetic name. It doesn't change anything data-wise, it's just more aesthetic for the user. Password, I will change that because that'll give me an option to log in again, so I don't need to remember that crazy password that I got for the initial account. Updating user password for the demo student was a success message at the bottom, so all that's good. I'll go back to my lab section. Now, if I drop this down here, we can actually compare the two bars here. If I go back to lab on my faculty side and then back to Internet Explorer this side, you can see the differences. Here on the faculty side, I have my students' labs, and if I select that, of course, my students haven't got any labs yet because I only just logged in as one student. I haven't had the chance to create a lab yet, so this is empty, but it's my students' labs, so the faculty member can see students' labs. Whereas in the Internet Explorer browser, logged in as a student, demo student, here, I've got the published lab section. So these are labs published by my faculty members, by my class owners, if you like. And when I drop the list down, you can see I can see a published class, CTS2396C, with this section ID called Demo Lab. Oh, that's nice. One of my instructors has shared a lab with me. I can duplicate it. But like I mentioned earlier, you don't have to have a published lab to be able to use this as a student. As long as you belong to a class, you can log in, and then you can click the Create button and create a blank lab. It is exactly the same way a faculty member would see it, and start from scratch. You can create your own virtual machines, your own lab volumes, and create your own networks, and do whatever you like from scratch. Even rename it as my own lab, for example. And this is just your own. And now that I have my own lab, if I go back to the faculty page, refresh the lab section, you'll see that I can drop this box, and CTS2396C class with this section ID, demo student at Brown.edu, owns a lab called My Own Lab. And one of the great things about this is I can then load that lab. Now I'm a faculty member, now looking at the student's lab, and I can change the components within that student's lab. This is okay because this is my student. He's in my class, so I can interact with his lab. I can't get all students' labs, they have to belong to my class. Now let's go back to the student. So here's the student. So he's got his own lab. I'll delete that. There we go. So we're back to no labs at all. I'm back at the faculty page. If I select lab again. Now none of my students have labs, there we go. And this time I'm going to select the published lab called Demo Lab. And I'll click the button called Copy to My Labs, and it, magically it appears over here as the Demo Lab. And you can see, put the window up at the top there somewhere, there we go. And you can see that the Demo Lab has two machines, one called FedoraBox, one called Winbox. All this detail about the lab that was pre-prepared by the faculty member has been recreated in the student's environment. 2 NICs, 1 NIC, public and private networks, the 2 volumes, it's all ready to go. So the only thing left to do as a student is to now activate this lab. I should do that with the Activate button. Now Activate actually takes all of these components in this design and assigns them to a hypervisor and creates real virtual components. So click it once and wait for it. Normally there's a little spinny icon or something like that to show you that it's still working. And before you know it, bingo bango, green background, you have a live lab. Now some of the buttons are just livened up here, the on button and the console button, for instance. This is still Internet Explorer, just to kind of demonstrate that it works across browsers. Mostly the reason for that is because, as you can probably tell from the components, a lot of this is HTML4 maximum stuff. This is not HTML5 until we get really to the console section, which really needed the 5 components. So now I have an active volume. This is now active on a hypervisor. You get the little green bar under the Demo Lab section to show that it is actually active, and the Demo Lab button itself is highlighted in green to show that that's the section we're looking at now. I could create another blank lab like that, you see, that's the difference. The green bar shows that it's active, but the green button shows that that's the one I'm looking at. So I can then switch between the two, like that. You get me? I'll delete lab 2. So there we go, back to lab, back to Demo Lab. So now we have these 2 machines, and I can start using these as a lab environment. So I can turn the machine on, or I can go to its console. And I can turn the machine on, and then if I go to its console, here I get the machine is already turned on. I've got about 50 seconds left to hit a key, or it will test the media, which can take a little while. Or I can install Fedora 20 from this media, so that's what I'll choose to do. I'll choose to go through the installation. You can see at the top here I've got a device called CD1 with Fedora 20 in it. I can change the media in the CD1 drive to any of the ISO volumes. I've also got buttons for Control Alt Delete, and there's also a shutdown button for ACPI shutdown for nice shutdowns as opposed to regularly powering off, and of course there's the power off button to shut it down immediately. You'll notice I have a kind of a trailing cursor here. You can see the local cursor and the remote cursor, and one's a little bit behind the other. I'm sure I don't need to explain which is which, so I can just go through the installation here and treat the machine as if I were sitting right in front of it. There's buttons on the second row here. I'm looking at the FedoraBox console right now, but since I'm in the console section, I can now change to the Winbox and switch over to the other virtual machine in my lab. This one's not currently on, so I can power it on. This one already has a base image, so this is going to boot from its disk. There's nothing in the CD-ROM media, so this one's going to boot straight from that base volume. This is Windows 2012 R2, 16 gig GUI image. And there's a button for back to lab, so I can leave the actual console section as it was and go back to the lab, and I can see now they've both got green highlight bars, and they're both working. So there we go, that's Internet Explorer as well, so it works in both of those, IE and Chrome. It works in Firefox too. I haven't tested Safari, I'll get to that later. So that's how a student actually sees a lab and can interact with the lab, and if they set up FedoraBox, because they have public and private network, maybe they can set this one up as a router, and Winbox is only attached to private network, they can set it up as a client which can then talk to FedoraBox and therefore get out to the internet. That'll work just fine. Alright, so that concludes this short video demo. If you have any other questions or future requests, they're always good. Drop me an email, mwhite@browder.edu. I know a couple of people have already been in touch with some feature requests. Go easy on me a bit with the interface design. I'm not a web developer, I'm the infrastructure guy who got saddled with the whole thing. So the whole kind of selection box and radio button and HTML buttons in seemingly odd order in order to accommodate the English language, take a volume and then assign it to a VM, for example. This is just something I had the skills to do, not necessarily the best way for it to be done. So some of the quirks of the user interface, not something I can really do much about now, but I'll be working on them in the future. More interested in, does it work? Is it useful for students? Can students use those consoles and do their labs for their networking classes in this environment? That's really what I'm looking for. I'm also looking for performance metrics. I want to know if it slows down with maximum number of users involved. It's currently running on 4 hypervisors. I can increase that to 9 in the short term and probably increase it to 12 in the long term. So I can add capacity where it's needed if it is indeed needed. I'd like also some performance metrics from using the machines with one virtual CPU each. That's really one thread on one of our dual Xeons hosts. So some of the Windows boxes might be a little slow, especially under a heavy load for the hypervisor. So I want to see how that works out over a load. So I'm looking for that kind of feedback. Any feedback, of course, is much appreciated. Thanks for watching.